I have with me today Colonel Douglas Macgregor. We're going to be going over the Russia-Ukraine war. What's going on here in the United States? Can any of it be fixed? And what the outlook for the future is. Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on today's show.
Sure.
So, more than 50% of the US population is against sending more aid to Ukraine. That polling percentage goes even higher if you don't include tracking or auditing the money or weapons being sent to Ukraine. Does Washington, D.C. regularly ignore the will of the American people in
Oh,
place
absolutely.
of the will of the top people in Washington, D.C.?
Absolutely. I would argue that, in most cases, no one in Washington pays attention unless they somehow or another are at risk. I mean, you'll recall when Obama was president, he was prepared to launch a really major air campaign into Syria. And when people got word of this through various mainstream media outlets, the phones rang off the hook. Members of Congress were deluged effectively with letters and statements and pleas for, we don't want to be in another war. We don't like where we are now. We want to get out. Forget it. And so he came to the podium planning to do this, and then suddenly said, nope, I'm not going to do this, and walked away. So the American people can have an impact. The problem is, I'm surprised as many as you cited are opposed to sending more aid because they've been treated to nothing but lies in the press. I mean, literally lies that are spun out as narratives by the intelligence agencies, primarily the CIA and MI6 in London. And everyone has essentially sung from the same sheet music all over Western Europe and the United States and in the English-speaking world.
Yeah. The propaganda is out of control, and I want to talk about that a little bit more. But do you think that there's any real damage that will be done to Ukraine by not passing more aid this last round in Congress? Because I'm reading this morning that President Biden had to jump on an emergency phone call with Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, Italy, Poland, to assure the leaders of those nations that the United States is still in this war, they're still supporting Ukraine, and that, yes, more American tax dollars will make their way to Ukraine, so don't give up on this war.
Well, I'm not really surprised, and I think it's important for your listeners to understand that none of this would be happening were it not for Washington. In other words, if Washington did not want this conflict to erupt, it would never have erupted. All they had to do was listen to what the Russians were telling us, which is, we won't accept Ukrainian membership in NATO. End of discussion. It's off the table. And that if you press this, we will defend ourselves. And of course, for 8 years, we built this Ukrainian army into a fairly formidable instrument with the goal of attacking Russia, the two so-called breakaway provinces in the east, and then ultimately to regain control of the Crimea. So I think they finally said, no one's listening to us. You'll recall that several proposals were tabled before all of this began on the 22nd of February, and nothing happened. So that needs to be understood. If Washington said tomorrow morning, ladies and gentlemen of NATO, we've had it. We're not going to underwrite this any longer. We're stopping our aid, then they would too. There's no question about that. And that would make it impossible for the Zelensky regime to continue its operations. And of course, that would send an unambiguous signal to the Russians that, number one, we're not going to intervene militarily in this, and we're not going to support this regime anymore, which means that the regime will have to negotiate. And the Russians have not really altered their conditions for the end of this business. What they've always said is, first of all, Ukraine, now whatever remains of it, must be neutral. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Now, they also want a representative inside the Ukrainian government, someone who sits on the Ukrainian equivalent of the National Security Council, who is there essentially to watch out for Russian national security interests, to make sure that under no circumstances will Ukraine become again what it is now, which is a deadly threat to Russia. And then finally, they're going to demand territorial concessions. I think they still want Kharkov. I assume Odessa. Whether or not there's a willingness to talk about that is unclear to me. But certainly all of the territory that they currently hold in Kharkov will have to return to Russian hands. And note, I say return because those areas have always been Russian, full of Russians, filled with Russian speakers, never permanently part of Ukraine or this entity, this regional state we call Ukraine. Absolutely not. So that's where we are. And I think Biden and his friends were shocked that there was that much opposition to sending more aid. I mean, thus far, what has Congress done on any number of issues? Border, immigration, the war in Ukraine, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, 2,000 income transfer programs we call welfare. What have they always done? Nothing. Nothing. And that's why we called a uniparty. It was interesting to listen earlier today to some Republicans talk about the border and act as though they were so upset and concerned about it. Well, where were they 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago? Yeah, it's a lot of nonsense. I think the American people will come around to figuring all of this out, but I think it's going to take some more pain, which I think is coming. You know, we're on the pain train when it comes to the financial system and the economy. No question. It's the only question of when does the engine seize up, and everybody then says, "Oh, we got to get off."
Yeah, well, I think with all of the illegal immigrants going into Chicago and New York City specifically, it seems like a lot of Democrat voters have had their eyes open for the first time, where maybe Republicans down in Arizona and Texas and California have been complaining until it's gotten further north and threatened their welfare systems and their neighborhoods and their tax dollars. It hasn't really become real. Going back to something you said, you said that Biden could end this, but he very clearly said in his United Nations address that Vladimir Putin alone has the power to end this war tomorrow. But that's not true. So why would he say things like that? Is he hoping the American people aren't listening or that we're stupid?
Well, he's trying to maintain the fiction that Russia is something that it is not. He keeps sort of depicting President Putin and his government as some sort of authoritarian, anti-Western, anti-democratic regime. That's not really true. This Russia has nothing in common with the Soviet Union. It has a little bit in common with Tsarist Russia. They have a stronger central authority because historically, the largest country in the world, Russia, has needed that strong central authority to survive. But otherwise, it is by no means the sort of satanic entity that the Biden administration and its supporters claim. Far from it. In fact, if you were going to make that argument, you have to turn to Ukraine, where you can find plenty of evidence for that sort of satanic character. The Russians have acted very defensively throughout this entire thing. You recall when they went in, they only went in initially with 90,000 troops. Then they began increasing those numbers as it became clear that no one would negotiate with them. When it was finally obvious that any further negotiation was impossible after Boris Johnson showed up in Kiev and told everybody on behalf of Biden, we're going to support you as long as it takes, no matter what, then the Russians said, well, this is not going to work. And so the small army that everyone was claiming was incapable suddenly went on to the defensive. And that started in the fall. They're up to almost 1 million men under arms now. The army has transformed. They're better equipped than they've ever been. This is a much more lethal force than anything Russia fielded in the 1980s. And lately, you've had some very stark warnings come out of Moscow. One of the more popular and famous figures in the Duma, who is very close to President Putin, said just within the last few days, this is the situation. Ukraine can accept our demands, meet our demands, or it can cease to exist.
Wow.
And he's very close to President Putin.
Yeah.
I think that's the mood. I think people have had it with it because their great nightmare is you sit down with the West, You negotiate another settlement. You ask for neutrality. They promise you neutrality. And instead, they give the place cancer, which is essentially what we did in the coup in 2014. We gave the place terminal cancer. So that means that the Russians will probably press on in the weeks ahead all the way to the river. I'd be very surprised if they didn't. They're in a position where they can move up and seize Kharkov almost immediately. And the Ukrainians have evacuated large numbers of people from Kharkov with that expectation in mind. They've also evacuated a number of people from Kherson and parts of Odessa. It may be that the Russians will cross the river while the river is very low, move over into Western Ukraine and down into Odessa. I don't know. They have the capability to do this. Remember, Putin has been reluctant to do it for three reasons. Number one, he didn't want to provoke intervention from the West because he doesn't want to go to war with us. I mean, imagine that. What a novel idea. I wish people in Washington shared that view. Secondly, he didn't want to take heavy casualties. He decided, let's wear out these Ukrainians first, and that's where they are now, completely worn out. But I don't think he or his generals ever thought that the Ukrainian forces would hurl themselves relentlessly into these defenses, which they had absolutely no chance whatsoever of cracking. I think they're amazed. And right now, if your viewers have paid any attention, you got to look for it, but you can find it. There are mass desertions. Mass surrenders are occurring up and down the line. Ukrainian soldiers are tired. They're exhausted. They've been shot to pieces. The people that are out there now are probably the least trained soldiers that Ukraine has ever fielded. These are effectively civilians who a few weeks ago were conductors on trolleys, driving buses, teaching school, cleaning streets. Welcome to the Ukrainian army, and off you go to the meat grinder. These people don't want to die, and I think they've had it. The other thing is that the Russians have been very smart. They haven't mistreated the Ukrainians. They know if they surrender, they come up on a frequency if they can, and they all speak Russian. And they say, look, we want to come over. We can't evacuate our wounded. No one will help us. And the Russians say, sure, come over. And they move them through a process. They're fed, they're cared for. And then at the earliest opportunity, I'm sure they'll be repatriated. The other thing is that Ukrainian soldiers know that they're battalion commanders. These are lieutenant colonels. Probably many of the company commanders, certainly everyone above lieutenant colonel, is essentially cheating them out of their salaries. Whereas we're paying the Ukrainian army's salary. Let's face it. We've got Ukraine is the 51st state. And they know that these commanders are carrying people on the rolls who have been dead for months, killed in action. Well, why are they doing that? Because money to pay them keeps showing up. And so these officers are pocketing the cash. Now, what happens to the widows, the orphans? Well, they're getting nothing. I mean, this is a vicious circle of corruption that in wartime is probably even worse than it was before this thing started. So Ukraine is a completely dysfunctional state. If you're looking for an example of a failed state, this is it. And we're keeping the failed state safe on life support. Ukraine is a failed state on life support. That's about it. But that's also for theater here. Remember George Kennan, and many of your viewers will remember that name. He was a brilliant man, and he shaped in many ways our thinking about foreign policy, certainly at the outset of the Cold War. He warned against the folly of helping Stalin. He told everyone that was insanity. We'd pay a terrible price for it. No one listened. Finally, after Roosevelt died and Truman met with Stalin, he figured out that Kennan was right. And Kennan accurately assessed and analyzed the Soviet Union. He also made it clear that the way to defeat the Soviets was not in a head-on attack. It was to contain them. Now, he didn't say contain communism everywhere because he knew communism everywhere wasn't the same. But he knew that containing Russia, Russian communism, the Soviet Union, was important. And of course, it worked. It fell apart. And he was still alive when his prognostications finally came true. But Kennan used to complain that we do things in foreign policy really to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. We don't do things for rational reasons. Rationality would have dictated an end to this terrible conflict months ago. So why does it go on? Well, you've got a lot of people that can't retreat from bad policy stances. We'll support you till the bitter end. Well, why? Why is Russia our enemy? Oh, yeah, Russia's our enemy. Really? What have they done to us lately? Oh, well, they're always bad. This is the sort of blatant stupidity that has been easy to sell in the United States, because in the world I grew up in, Russia was the enemy. The Soviet spies always spoke with a Russian accent. We knew who the enemy was. That all went away in 1992. Russia is a great power. Russia has much more in common with Tsarist Russia than it did with the Soviet Union, and Tsarist Russia was not an evil place. So this is all nonsense that needs to go away. Unfortunately, it's deeply rooted, and the politicians won't abandon it, because if they abandon it, they might be held accountable. Now, I think the accountability issue is probably more likely to occur in Europe before it happens here. We've already begun to see that. We had these elections in Slovakia. We now have a prime minister in Slovakia who is dead set against this Ukraine war, wants to end it. He is the tip of a very large iceberg. And I think in Germany, France, and many other countries, we're going to see turnovers in government. Now, I'm not saying that one turnover and everything comes up roses, but I think we're in for a long, bumpy ride in Europe. And I think we're going to start one here as well, because all the proverbial chickens are coming home to roost.
Yeah.
All the things we've ignored, all the mistakes we've made, everything, it seems to be coming together in a kind of perfect storm.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Poland's having a change of heart. Slovakia has this new person in charge. Germany and France, they're unhappy. America's unhappy. We could have another Trump time. We could have an RFK. Lots could change. I don't know if you saw this or not. It took thinking about it for a minute to sink in, but on the one hand, you and I see that Russia's growing, that they're building this army, they're pumping out ammunition and weapons 24 hours a day. But then over in Ukraine, they're saying, listen, with only 5% of your defense budget, we've done more with your money than the US military could do. That's how good we are. We've taken out half of the Russian army with 5% of your budget. I mean, isn't that insulting and a lie at the same time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's completely ludicrous. You depend upon who you talk to. And this is tough, because obviously people are not revealing the truth in the West about much of anything. But I talked about 400,000 dead. Now my sources and my colleagues are telling me, Doug, it's up to 450,000 or more. The situation is that grim. They tell me now about 60 to 70,000 amputees. How many hundreds of thousands of casualties beyond that exist? We don't know. But when you see an army that begins to melt away, which is what's happening right now in eastern Ukraine, it's pretty obvious that this war is lost. There's no question about it. The war is lost. Any reasonable man would come to this conclusion and say, we have to sue for peace. If we don't sue for peace, we'll go under. But you remember, this regime and its sponsors in the West, what I call the Western rich oligarchs, that really control things behind the scenes in Washington and London and elsewhere. They want this to go on, and it doesn't matter to them what really happens to the Ukrainian nation. It's very obvious to me that Zelensky doesn't, because if he did, he would have stopped this a long time ago. You're killing the seed corn of future generations in Ukraine. And now they want us to round up Ukrainian men who have fled to the West and send them back so that they too can take their place among the dead. No, this is insanity. And Americans would never do this. They would have intervened and said, this is wrong. We've got to stop. We're not that bad. We do have some humanity left in us, but it's not in Washington.